Alright, so the homunculi. We made a lot of progress in the last video with world building. There are some other things I could have mentioned, but overall, I think I did a pretty good job of laying out what Table City, the Sacred Plateau, and Mount Poros are in the symbolical language of the film. Having done that, I'm going to get to the heart of the matter, which is the homunculi. This is the central portion of the criticism that I'm addressing, namely that the film is not connected, but more specifically that the villains that everyone knows and love to hate from Fullmetal Alchemist are not present in Sacred Star of Milos. And this is just not true. It's just that they're present in a way that fans weren't expecting. Not literally, but symbolically. And that symbolic expression manifests through the city itself, the workings of the city, and the secret to the Milosian form of alchemy revealed in the twin transmutation circles. Now, the diagram for these circles is hidden in the Black Bat's secret base. And this is located within the city, but more specifically, the ancient Milosian city, which is chiseled from rock and is located beneath the roots of the sacred mountain, underneath the Cretan base and the Cretan territory. I'd made some notes here because this is going to get pretty complicated, so if you see me glancing over, that's why. There's a lot to cover in this video, and I just don't trust my memory to put everything in the proper order. So I think the best place to start in all of this is to reiterate that people who say that there are no homunculi in this movie, and therefore it lacks a strong antagonist, and that Atlas is just kind of a movie-only standing character with no real ties to Fullmetal Alchemist, is to completely miss the point of the film by thinking this way. Because the message of this film is that we are each our own greatest enemy. We all play the part of father with our family of 7 sins when we cling to like our addictions and pride or money. Now, in Sacred Star of Milos, Ashley Crichton is the one who represents this struggle, as the personification, though, of Alphonse Elric. The reason for this is that Alphonse, above all other characters in Fullmetal Alchemist, is the one who has to overcome himself for the good of humanity. He literally gives up his body to keep his spirit in the armor and fight for his friends. And this is why having Ashley Crichton play the role of Alphonse Elric, while simultaneously playing the role of father who commands the 7 sins, or in Sacred Star of Milos, who commands the power of the city, the 7 lights hidden beneath the ground, using the Philosopher's Stone, is a great move. It's a brilliant reinterpretation, re-examination of Fullmetal Alchemist. Really what it is it's alchemy on Fullmetal Alchemist as a series. It's analysis of the themes that were most important. It's a deconstruction of those themes into their component parts. The Sacred Plateau, the Holy Mountain with the spirit of Fullmetal Alchemist, the Valley of Sin and Tragedy where these atrocities occur and the people are forced to live in poverty, much like the Ishbalans who are taken advantage of because of a lust for the Philosopher's Stone and the glory of Armistice. And then it's a reconstruction, a weaving back together, or the telling of a story, as in the book, Don't Forget 311, of all of these hidden themes, where the truth within truths comes to light. And that's really what we're dealing with here, is not just the truth, which in Sacred Star of Milos is represented by Don't Forget 311, and is synonymous with the cruelty of the world. When Ashley reads of the forbidden manuscript and studies his father's teachings, it occurs in a sequence that very much resembles the biblical narrative of the fall of man in the garden. And the reason for this choice, this narrative choice, is pretty obvious. He's an innocent child. He opens up the forbidden alchemical literature and he discovers these two transmutation circles, which he understands at that moment to be the heart of the city, and he gets that this is revealing that you have to sacrifice human lives. So it's like his innocence is lost, right? And just like in the Bible, where the Judeo-Christian tradition speaks of the fall of man in the terms of God warning man that as soon as you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, or understanding, in that moment you shall surely die. And we see this is exactly what happens when Ashley reads, don't forget 3:11, he discovers the cruelty of the truth, and within seconds his parents are killed because he's being initiated into the story of Fullmetal Alchemist. The one who kills his parents, we learn by the end of the film, is Lieutenant Atlas, which is really a cipher and is nothing more or nothing less than the world, right? Lieutenant Atlas is Lieutenant World, okay? And that is pretty much equivalent to the biblical concept of Satan, the prince of this world, the ruler of the air, you know, and the lieutenant is like the overseer or the one put in charge of the world. So reading the book 3:11 is learning the cruelty of the truth, an ongoing motif in Fullmetal Alchemist, where the keeper of the gateway to knowledge is cruel but just. He demands a toll because you're not supposed to know this forbidden information. You can learn it, but you must sacrifice something. So it's difficult, but the knowledge that you acquire is worth it if what you're seeking is, you know, understanding or power. Interfacing with that, Ashley discovers the truth, but as all good Fullmetal Alchemist fans know, it doesn't stop there. The story never ends with the truth, because Fullmetal Alchemist is a story about the truth within the truth. And that's what we're getting into when we're getting into the homunculi, and why I had to save it until after I had done some world building and explained to you that Table City is literally a rock bell surrounded by an Ouroboros, because that is reenacting the Ouroboros being the Valley of Suffering and being directly paralleled with Ishval, in fact being swallowed down, as we learned in our previous video, by the Western Desert and ending, or in the Eastern Desert, excuse me, and ending up in the Western territory of Creta, talking about like the Eastern philosopher and the Western philosopher. And so they represent the Ishvalan people, or you could even say Scar, the scarred man. And that within this scar lies a rock bell, hinting at one of the most poignant subplots in the Fullmetal Alchemist manga, which is Scar's relationship to Winry. This tragic situation where he like killed her parents, but he did it in a fit of rage, and then when he actually meets Winry and realizes what he's done, that's actually his motivation to change as a character and go from villain to anti-hero to finally hero at the end of the story. I think one of the best character arcs in the Fullmetal Alchemist manga is Scar's character. And the reason I had to do that is because that is showing you the truth within the truth. The city itself has a trident on the top, 3, and 2 flukes, almost like an anchor, 3:11. And that's precisely what it is. It's an anchor for the Fullmetal Alchemist story. But there's another detail that I didn't mention in the previous video because I wasn't ready to talk about the homunculi, and that is the fact that there is another set of flukes inside going down in the tower. There's a pair outside, and then there is another pair inside, like this, within the tower going up with the three prongs like that. And what that represents is the truth within the truth. The truth within the truth is the workings of the actual city, or the creation of the homunculi. Now, what does that mean? Right? We've established that the truth itself is the cruelty of the world, but what is the truth within truths? To answer this question, we have to take a little diversion that might not seem relevant at first, but I promise you is going to pay dividends. And that is to the second flashback scene in Sacred Star of Milos, featuring the actual brother, Ashley Crichton, not the fake brother that's with Julia through most of the film. Because the first flashback represents the truth, or the cruelty, but the second flashback represents the truth within the truth. Now, when we first see Ashley, he's studying his father's research notes engraved with 311. But the second time we see Ashley, before his grand reveal at the end of the film, as, what's his name, Lieutenant Herschel, is when he's searching through the trash with his sister, and she discovers a little funeral urn or a little piece of pottery. I call it a funeral urn just because it's appropriate to how the Milosians burn their dead, cremate their dead, and I theorize that it would make sense for them to have a little pot for the ashes. And that's kind of what it looks like. I mean, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But I'm going to call it that. She finds a little funeral urn, and it's got 3 emerald dots on it, 3 gemstones set, inlaid into it. And it has a star on either side and one on the back. When she looks at it from the front, though, you see 3, and then you see the 2 stars with a reflection connecting the 2. 311. And therefore, you can see that this scene is metaphorical or allegorical for the truth within truth. That is the love between Ashley and his sister Julia. The neat thing is when they go to transmute the little funeral urn, they're on top of the crusher wheel where the final scene actually takes place. And so here you have the idea of coming full circle or destiny. Very appropriate because that final fight is occurring right by the split where the valley opens up, the Ouroboros, the actual point where the river comes around and eats itself. The rock crusher is on this little island, you know, at a little prominence at the head of that. So what this represents is the link in the Ouroboros, right? The link in destiny. So it's very appropriate that the truth within truth sequence occurs when they're small children at this place, because that's where everything comes back to rest. With that in mind, things get really interesting when you notice the design of Ashley's transmutation circle for turning the funeral vase into a set of earrings. Because when he places it, when Julia places that on his transmutation circle, it actually is in the exact shape of Table City. All right? And this is where you see this digression starts to weave back into our earlier theme of Table City being a 311, but having like a secret other 11 that goes down into the depths where the stone is made. All right? Because that's the parallel being established here. That the external truth is cruel, but the internal truth is actually the love of these 2 siblings and is actually the heart of the story. This is essential to comprehend because that is what the Philosopher's Stone chamber in Milos represents. The love between Ashley and Julia. And this is the pivot around which everything turns. Now the symbol you're going to need to make that connection is the phoenix, appropriately enough, the symbol of Milos. And how you're going to make that connection is you're going to see that when the wide shot occurs after Ashley and Julia have laid the funeral urn on the transmutation circle, and it shows the alchemy occurring from a distance, you'll see that the Creighton rock crusher actually looks like the Milosian flag. Ashley and Julia are standing on the top of the head, and then there's a beak that wraps around, and then the other side of the wheel goes like this. There's one of the central rock crushing spires that looks like a beak and the head of like an eagle or a phoenix, and then the part of the rock crusher that goes down like a ladder with a little command center on it, that's actually the wing, one of the outspread wings of the phoenix that's like flying. So you can actually see this idea of Milos, the city, Table City, sitting on top of this bird. Now, in that scene, there's no fire. It's just the skeleton or the bones. Because the Milosian people are all dead, right? They've been killed, their land's been taken, their bones are buried in the ground, and they're covered with trash. So what seems to be a disconnected sequence is actually the archetype of what Table City is and the whole story of the valley. The whole tragedy of the territory that was stolen from the Milosians. And this symbol will reoccur when, after the truth is activated by Atlas in the watchtower of the city, and the blood flows down through the blood seal of Alphonse, like we discussed. This is emulating the mistake that Ed and Al made of transmuting humans, during which Al's soul is taken out of his body and put into the homunculus, all right, which is the armor of Alphonse. Like, in the narrative of Alphonse representing, like, Ashley and the 7 sins and, like, the whole story coming together, the armor is the false body, or, you know, the fake. And the mountain of which the armor is made in the image of is the true Alphonse, more specifically, like, the fire in the mountain, his soul attached to the armor, right? So you go through this narrative of Atlas activating the truth in the tower. That's literally a giant eyeball. If you look at it, when it activates like a giant eye. The blood goes down into the center of the eye, and if you actually look at the shot where the blood comes down the tube, it's actually in the shape of an Ouroboros dragon. So that's what? The all-seeing eye, right? The Fuhrer, okay? And it actually comes down in the shape of a swastika. It's like spinning down like a swastika, and a bird that's been killed. So this is like the Fuhrer, you know, Fuhrer King Bradley, I guess, if you want. We'll get into that later, because each of the homunculi have a specific part of the city or the valley that represents them. And, of course, the command post is going to represent Pride. Or Pride is the FMA1 Fuhrer, or Wrath, who is the FMA2 Fuhrer. Which is crazy, because this movie actually combines both FMAs. So that means that there's a couple homunculi that are different, and they're actually crossed. Like, their symbolism, both of their symbolisms for both prides. The little kid who is the son, the adopted son of the Fuhrer in the manga, and the actual Fuhrer from FMA1 manga are both included. I'm not even going to go into that now, because that's insanity. You know what I mean? That gets really complicated. I'm giving you the building blocks of the truth within the truth. Atlas activates the truth. It flows down. But see, that's the truth within truths. Because that's where Ed and Julia intervene and rescue the Philosopher's Stone, which, though forged through great suffering, is actually what is used to save the valley. So the love hidden within the cruelty is the truth within the truths. And that place where the stone is forged, that central chamber, when you look at it from above, when Ed, Al, and Julia are pursuing Atlas, it's in the shape of the phoenix. It's in the exact shape of the flag of Milos. So this is like the heart of the phoenix, the fire in the firebird, so to speak. And this is the sequence that's going to tie disconnected, disparate things, the cruelty of the opening of the movie and the love and tenderness of the scene between Ashley and Julia in the valley, together in this very powerful visual illustration of one of the most fundamental concepts of Fullmetal Alchemist, which is the truth within truths. So in Sacred Star, it's literally just, you know, literally there's a city that is 311 with another 311 inside of it. Very cool how this is done, because the characters are actually fighting to discover the truth within the truth. They're actually fighting inside of, you know, their own struggle, their own plot, so to speak. Very self-referential, very awesome reference to Fullmetal Alchemist. Now, the stone itself represents something you may not expect, which is the earring, or more to the point, the piercing. And you wouldn't be able to understand this unless I had linked that scene where Ashley makes the earrings for Julia for you. Because with that understanding, you can actually start to comprehend the diagram that's in the Black Bat's hideout as the city, which, now that I've pointed it out to you, looks exactly like Ashley's little funeral urn, doesn't it? I mean, the actual city in the diagram. And the valley in the city is actually, if you divide the city in half, and you take each side as half, that is actually in the exact shape of the earrings that Ashley makes for Julia. So now you're really getting into some crazy stuff. This is the territory of God, or God's domain, as it's referred to in the film, where the power of creation and destruction is comprehended. So why earrings? Why the power of creation and earrings? You know, what? Now, it's obvious that the scene, the flashback scene with Ashley and Julia is kind of like a promise, because Ashley doesn't like that they live in this valley filled with trash. And so he's it's almost like a promise, like, I'm transmuting this piece of discarded trash for you and making it into beautiful earrings because I want to make a better world for you, Julia. And this is Ashley's story throughout the film. He's an idealist. He wants to find the truth, but he doesn't just want the truth, because that's Atlas's role. Atlas wants the truth because he wants to control cruelty and he wants to rule his own nation, right? Ashley is similar in that he wants to find truth, but he is different in that the only reason he wants to find truth is to make a better world for his sister. And that is the fundamental difference between the Ashley-Atlas dual nature that needs to be understood. The earring symbolizes that. As all Fullmetal Alchemist fans know, the earring is actually a pretty poignant device used because Ed gets these earrings for Winry, and in the final battle, you know, he holds on to them and promises to give them back. And so it's kind of like, you know, I'll see you after you win the fight kind of a thing. And there's also another importance to the earring in that when Riza and Winry first meet, when Roy and Riza come to check up on Ed and Al's alchemical skills, Winry doesn't like soldiers, but she takes a liking to Riza's inner kindness. And as a result of that, after witnessing Riza's grace as a woman, Winry decides she wants earrings because, you know, Riza had earrings and it made her seem like more beautiful to Winry or more adult. And simultaneously, Riza likes Winry's long hair because she has short hair in the military and the long hair reminds her of her youth. So you've got this cross between the child wanting to be more mature and the mature adult, having witnessed the sorrows of the world, wanting to be more childlike. And this is represented by the earring and also by the hair. So there is a precedent for this whole earring thing within the Fullmetal Alchemist canon. At some point in the future, I will demonstrate to you clearly how actually both of those sub-narratives are included in Milos. But for now, just recognize that the earring symbolizes love, and that this love is the underlying principle, the truth within truths of Ashley's desire for creation. The catch is that what was intended and what occurs are different. Ashley intended to learn this truth to be used for love, but ironically, he ends up as the head of the Cretan military on a quest for vengeance and has to use his powers for destruction. And this is the great tragedy of the Sacred Star of Milos and the obstacle, the hurdle that must be overcome in order for Ashley to recover his true self and purge himself of hatred. And this twist is represented by the fact that in the earring, or on the earring, there's a design of a sacred star, holy to the people of Milos, with 7 rays coming off of it. These 7 rays represent, in Judeo-Christian tradition, the 7 days of creation, basically. But in Hebrew mysticism, it's a little more specific, and they actually represent the Elohim, which is not considered in like Kabbalic reasoning to be another name for God, but rather a name for the agents of God's power. Kind of like angels. There's some debate on that, but let's just talk about it in the terms of angels for now, because it's useful in the narrative of the Garden of Eden that we've kind of toyed with, and the biblical subtext of the film, to recognize the homunculi as a kind of fallen angels. And you make this connection because there's 7 homunculi, there's 7 rays on the sacred star. The sacred star represents the workings of the city, which is the Philosopher's Stone, and more specifically, the ability to control magma, or the Ouroboros serpent, the dragon's pulse, which is emblazoned onto Professor Crichton's research notes. And so in that you have the transmutation of the 7 angels, or the 7 Elohim, to the 7 homunculi who serve, you know, God or Father in Fullmetal Alchemist. And once you get all that, things get really cool, because that earring motif is one of the most powerful symbols in the film, as it represents the valley itself. One earring is one side, the other earring is the other side. And that pesky little 3rd star that I mentioned way back, that's on the back, represents the invisible force that binds the other 2 stars together. And you see this in the final scene because The scene is shot from two perspectives, which represent 2 points of view. One is Edward, who's fighting for Milos, this side of the valley. And the camera angles when Ed is fighting Ashley are always oriented with the little valley people's village in the background of Ed defending them. So that side is Milos, and then the other side, which is the world, or like the military, and Ashley's warped persona after going through so much suffering. So the cruelty of the world. So the truth and the truth within the truth, right? And it is very appropriate that Atlas is the name of the villain and also is the character whom Ashley kind of reenacts. He kind of becomes the man that he hates. Because Atlas, as you know, in mythology, is the titan that has to bear the weight of the world. And when you're dealing with biblical metaphors and the 7 sins, it's only appropriate to have a Christ figure. So the man bearing the weight of the burden is Ashley. And his name, Ashley, literally means the valley of, or the meadow of ashes, or the one who resides in the ash tree. Very appropriate for a man who is fighting for a vanished nation that has been burned to ashes. It's really cool stuff. So, having made all this connection on a general level, you can actually take the shape of the earrings to represent the valley as a whole, and the 2 fiery bows that Ashley controls with the power of his transmutation circles is like that binding force, or that fate that links everything together. And of course, remember, they're on the prominence that is at the center of the serpent devouring itself in the geography of the valley. I'm going to cover one more point on this. There's a lot more I could do, but I will be satisfied with explaining to you what is the rock crusher. I've skirted around it, and I've showed, what it's made in the image of, what it represents. But in that final scene, that link in the chain, what is the rock crusher? Well, the rock crusher is nothing less than the military pocket watch with 311 engraved inside of it. And that is a perfect symbol to represent the quest for the truth within truths, which is what this movie is all about. The reconciling of the alchemist and his desire to do good with the power he wields to commit evil acts, represented by his sins, or the homunculi. And this is a concept that's very familiar to fans of the first FMA, because in that, the homunculi are not beings created with a philosopher's stone at their center, or even a person who becomes a higher being by injecting a philosopher's stone into himself. But rather, they're Frankensteinian creations of alchemists, failed human transmutations that have bodies and minds but no souls. And as a catharsis for their horrible existence, and as a punishment and a constant reminder of who they are, they actually have to eat human lives to live. This, I think, was actually one of my favorite things about FMA 1. And I find it superior to the origin of the homunculi in Arakawa's manga. I think the Frankenstein concept is one of the most powerful in science fiction literature, and I loved the way that FMA 1 used Frankenstein and Dr. Frankenstein as an archetype for the alchemist and their creations. This is the context that you have to deal with the homunculi in when analyzing Sacred Star, because it's a symbolic alchemy. Right? It's not the literal alchemy of breaking down people and using their souls in this sick ritual to make philosopher's stones. It's the spiritual act of transmuting yourself into a better person, and in the process, overcoming your sins. This was made into a TV show by making the sins into literal creations that the people could then fight with, which is really cool. And this is the context in which you see of catharsis unfolding in the valley of, let's just call it the Valley of the Shadow of Death, because that's what it is. It's a giant valley filled with death with a shadow in it. And since we've already made the connections to the Christ types, and since, after all, 311 in the city is in the shape of a giant anchor, which is a 1st and 2nd century symbol, a cipher script for the cross, which early Christians used along with the fish to dodge Roman persecutions of their growing religion. Meaning you've basically got a valley with a giant cross in the center of it, in the shape of 311, don't forget Fullmetal Alchemist, and then you have this valley of suffering in the shape of the Ouroboros. Very clear archetypes of the Christian tradition and the crucifixion and the overcoming of one's self. And this is why the earring is so perfect, because what's another name for an earring? A piercing, right? Just like Christ's side was pierced when he's suffering, just like you say, I let out a piercing cry because I was so distraught, right? So it's all about Ashley making a piercing. Keeping his promise to his sister to remake the world, but having to work through the corruption in his soul that has occurred in the 5 years that they've been apart, right? So when they're fighting on that wheel, it's actually, the wheel is actually the pocket watch. The fire coming over it, if you look, is actually drawn like chain links, like the chain that Ed presents his pocket watch on during the film. And if you look where the bows come around to the point of the cross in the center, on one side there's 3 bars that are being lit up, and the other side that there's 2. And then if you look at the way that the flames come over and the way that the little command center is shown like this, it's simultaneously in the shape of the earring, because Julia's earring has like this teardrop shape and like kind of like a round hump. Tear, right? A star on the front and a tear on the side, the morning star, which, you know, Christ or Lucifer. So that kind of represents like, you know, the homunculi being crucified, because it's like Christ on the cross, but he has our sin inside of him according to the Christian tradition. So that's the linking of the two. And the wheel actually looks like the little funeral urn. Okay? We've already established that the funeral urn is identical to the city. So what you've actually got going on in that final scene is a reenactment of what already happened in the city. Because when they fight in the depths of the city, there's a scale model of the city, because like the city eats itself, right? But now they're in the valley, and the valley eats the city. So it's like Inception, you know, Fullmetal Alchemist Inception, the city, within the valley. The dream within the dream, within the dream. The most sacred, the most hidden thing. And what is that in Fullmetal Alchemist? It's Ed's pocket watch, engraved with, don't forget, 311, that he never shows to anyone. It's his secret motivation. And thusly so for Ashley Crichton, his secret motivation is his love, hinted at to be more than just familial. It's incestuous to some degree, which is very appropriate because this is a creation narrative, and almost every nation's mythology, if you get right down to it, goes back to incest somewhere. You know, and what is incest really? It's this like forbidden closeness, right? Because it's like, not only are you making love and having sexual intercourse, but you're actually making love to your own family who you're already flesh and blood with. So it's like so intimate and so good, so to speak, that it's forbidden, right? This is insane because 311 is the day that of remembrance where Ed burned down his house for committing the taboo, right? So you've got this overlay of this really traditional like Japanese incest thing that the Japanese are all really into, onto mythology of incest in creation, the Greeks, the Judeo-Christian, the Japanese. I mean, so many cultures have a brother and a sister, or, you know, a father and a daughter, or a mother and a son as being like the primal forces of creation, you know, overlaid onto the taboo of human transmutation, right? That which must not be committed. All encapsulated in this scale model of the city, which is on the rock crusher, which is the military pocket watch of Ashley, the truth of the harshness, but also hidden within the pocket watch is the truth within truths. And you can see that because the bows flow over as, you know, 11 illuminating the 3 and 11 as they spin over the side. But then also in the middle, the crossbeam of the cross, there's little embers of flame that come up, and at key moments actually create 3 dots over the top and then the other 11 there. So the final fight over the Philosopher's Stone is a fight on the pocket watch. Or one might say, the fight on time itself, right? One of the central points of the film is that the world is cruel. This is demonstrated in the scene where Winry Rockbell, remember, representing the city. After the scene where you first see the city in the shape of a rockbell, she's riding on a train with Roy and Mustang, and she says, "It's been 5 years, that's so cruel. A lot can happen in 5 years. 5 years ago, Ed, Al, and I were all innocent little kids." This is my favorite development in the film, Because if you break 311 down into its component parts, right? 3 dots and 2 dots, right? What is that? 5, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not according to regular mathematics, but according to gematria, which is an ancient symbolical way to deal with numbers, you can reduce numbers into their base components and add them together. This seems appropriate to me in a film about alchemy. All right, so let's just grant me that. Because then what you have is a movie that's about 5 years, and the suffering endured over 5 years. It's about 311, which is synonymous with the 5 years. And at the end, when all becomes one and one becomes all in the fire of the valley, the characters are actually fighting on a pocket watch inscribed with 311, but also illustrating 5. In the shape of the hidden chamber where the tragedies and the human transmutations of Milos occurred. What is that? It's Laboratory 5, people. And if you look at the transmutation circles that overlay when they come together, when Atlas is activating the stone, they actually do form a pentagram. There you have it. What's happening on that in that final battle is the soul of Fullmetal Alchemist in visual form. And I've already discussed that it represents the Fullmetal Heart. Now, layering this additional world building and symbolic level of the homunculi, the symbolic homunculi, the catharsis of the alchemist overcoming his sin, Dr. Frankenstein fighting with Frankenstein, you start to see that this is indeed the most appropriate place for the link in the Ouroboros chain to occur, and for the gate of truth, which is discovering the real motivation for Ashley Crichton, comes to bear. I want to go into all of the 7 sins and the details of which parts of the city and the valley are represented by them, but that alone would take me like 2 videos, and this video is already really long. But I got on a roll and I didn't want to stop because I needed to communicate these ideas to you before we go any further. So I'm going to save that for a future video or future videos. And I'm going to stop here because I feel like I have communicated adequately the relationship between the earring, the city, 311, Laboratory 5, Ashley and Julia's love, and the harshness of the world, or Atlas. And getting that is fundamental to getting what's going on in the film, which is a transmutation of Ashley Crichton through catharsis. The chief visual of that is the fact that the funeral urn, which is actually the model of the city, as demonstrated in the Rock Crusher, and the earring are being overlaid on themselves. And in the climactic moment where Ashley brings down the 2 wheels of fire of God's domain onto the wheel, if you look at the way that the hands have climbed up the wall is actually in the shape of Ashley Crichton's face when he was a little kid, weeping a tear out of his eye. And then the wheels of fire go over that. And the image that you get is of the Rock Crusher like this, with Ashley standing in the middle of the funeral urn, or the command center, with a wing, a single wing coming off of that funeral urn and coming up into his face, which is the likeness of the mountain, who's crying a tear that is then transmuted into earrings. Everything comes full circle at the point of the Ouroboros where everything devours itself. And Ashley Crichton reenacts the process of him breaking down the little funeral urn and turning into earrings for his sister on a scale that encompasses the entire valley of Milos and the Sacred Mountain. And this is where the characters, the foreground, mirrors the background. That's a point I'm going to get into when I start discussing the second criticism, which is that the characters are irrelevant and they don't get enough screen time. But I'll leave you with one point right now that's crucial to everything. This whole thing, which I've already demonstrated, this whole narrative, this whole story, which I've already demonstrated to be in the vein of the crucifixion and the act of creation and the redemption of man through the catharsis, the purging of our sins, is the prototype of the Grail, the Holy Grail legend, and the story of the Fisher King. So this is the last point I'm going to leave you with. Milos and the land of Milos, stolen by Creta, is the wasteland. You can see this very clearly. It's a desert. It's been dug out. It's been robbed of its greenery, and it's been robbed of its honor. It's parallel to Ishval, which met a similar fate in the Fullmetal Alchemist series. And so it is the wasteland. Ashley Crichton, who sits in his command center, is the Fisher King. The Fisher King in mythology always has a wound that is dealt to him by either the Lance of Longinus or a sword or the Grail Cup. They're all synonymous in the mythology, called the Dolorous Blow. And the only way to heal the Dolorous Blow is to strike the Fisher King with the same, thing that wounded him in the first time. This is accomplished by a brave knight who comes to the wasteland, sees that everything is destroyed, and then asks the crucial question, which is like, who is the Fisher King? Or, what caused thee to be wounded, O Fisher King? And that's kind of the whole, that's the framework of this whole series. You come to the wasteland as Ed, you see this wounded character, this defaced or this concealed mystery character, and you must ask, who is the Fisher King, in order to understand the movie. Well, the Fisher King is none other than you or I. It's none other than God himself personified in Christ, who bears the sins of the world. It's the age-old archetypal story of man's redemption. That's what's going on here. And you have to understand that Fisher King reference. You also have to understand that in the legend, the Fisher King is usually bleeding from his thigh. And Ashley's character, through the majority of the film, sits in a command center with these pipes coming up that literally look like they're hooked into his leg. Now, what's actually happening there is he's hooked into a system where he can hear everything that's going on in the valley. But symbolically, it is almost as if those pipes are hooked into his legs, sucking his blood, because he's having to relive all of the tragedy of the valley as Atlas is cavorting around with his sister, and he has to suppress his rage. So it really is symbolically, sucking the life out of him to do this job. And that represents, the Fisher King, who sits on the throne and he bleeds from his thigh. Now, how that links to the story in the Ouroboros is the fact that, and now this is high-level analysis, and that's why I'm going to stop here, because it gets too confusing, it gets too muddled if I go any further without laying out a proper foundation. But I will give you this tidbit. The command center that Ashley sits in, if you look after his first and second appearance, which is when he opens his eye for the first time, and then later when he gives the order to continue the excavation process and move to the next phase of the Cretan plan to take over Table City, his face and the glass of the command center, if you look at the geothermal plant in the background and overlay it with the glass of the command center, it actually recreates the exact shape of his mask. Okay? And then behind it, the sacred mountain rises up and wraps around into like a place where you can't see. And he's sitting in the exact spot where the summit of the mountain would be. Like his head is where the mountain would go up to, but it's cut off by the command center. And then if you look at the command center, it's in the shape of like teeth or like a jaw. So it's literally like his face wrapping around, he's sitting in the command center at the source of the fire, and then the command center wraps around and eats his own face, right? So that's the Ouroboros. The Fisher King and the Ouroboros are like laid on top of each other in that scene, and that's where the party starts, because that's when you start getting into God's domain, the face or the image of God, and then that's the whole narrative of like Hohenheim and Father, where like the face is ripped off, and Dwarf in the Flask Homunculus, has the Hohenheim's face, but the true Hohenheim is fighting Homunculus. And that's where this story really gets epic, because it taps into the manga, which has never really been, put into an anime form in a way that I think does it justice until now. And so you have literally the whole Sacred Valley is behind Ashley as the true father, and then the city made in the image of the Sacred Valley is actually Dwarf in the Flask Homunculus. Okay? And that's like, that little truth within truth thing is actually like an alchemist flask with, the contents down in the center of it, Dwarf in the Flask, where all the evil is created. Hence the piercing, right? Because he's looking at his own suffering and he's pierced by it. And the earring represents that archetypal struggle to be reunified with his sister, which is, of course, nothing less than the valley itself. On that note, I think I pretty much detonated the first criticism of Fullmetal Alchemist, which is that it has no relation to the original story or characters. because this film is all about relation to the original story and the characters, and the design of the geography and the architecture of everything you see is symbolic and very profound, very intelligent, actually to the point where I am convinced that this is artistic inspiration, that maybe the director and the writer intended some of this stuff, but that it just took on a life of its own and is now containing, you know, self-evident truths that if you know where to look, you're going to find it. Which is pretty cool, because that's kind of people who, you know, have faith in God, that's pretty much what they believe the world to be, right? You can look at it and say, oh, it's chance, or you can look at it and say it was designed that way from the beginning. Those are like the two, you know, your two options. And those are kind of your two options with this film. You can say it was designed that way from the beginning, or you can say it was fate. But the cool thing is that the film is self-referential. The story is self-referential, and fate itself is a concept that is one of the core themes of coming full circle in this film, making it very difficult to say that this was accidental. And that's what's so cool about it. This is a true case, in my opinion, of art mirroring life, and certainly of art mirroring and doing justice to the source material. So, in my opinion, and quite simply, factually and objectively, if you cannot criticize this film for being unrelated to Fullmetal Alchemist, because everything about it is Fullmetal Alchemist. Now that I pointed out some of these things, I hope that you can begin to understand that. And in future videos, I plan on going into more detail about each of the 7 sins, and then I plan on going by a character-by-character basis and showing you how each of the series staples characters that you've come to know and love is given full exposure, and in fact, their most emotional scenes are replayed on the pages of the Valley as the story of Milos unfolds. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I look forward to seeing you in future videos. And who knows, maybe we can get a discussion going on. Alright, so I've enjoyed it. I hope you got something out of this video, and I will see you in the upcoming parts. See ya.